Hey, we're live.
All right, good afternoon. Welcome to the House Environment Committee. We are going to continue our conversation today about S 127. And Representative Logan has a proposal of amendment that she would like us to consider adding to our amendment, which is really just going to be a sort of suggestion to the General Housing Committee.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Representative.
Okay. So in Title 24 of the VSA, there is a section. I'm trying to get to that right now in the municipal and regional planning and development chapter. Section 4303 of Title 24 that sets out definitions for municipal and regional planning and development. So in that language posted here, you'll see that had the whole section for you.
Take it easy for you.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate that. I'm also just scrolling here through Title 24 to get to the right section.
I'm just looking at your amendment.
Yeah. So here this would redefine the term emergency shelter that is currently defined there as a shelter it provides temporary shelter for the homeless in general or for specific populations of the homeless and does not require occupants to sign leases or occupancy agreements. So that's our current definition of emergency shelter for municipalities.
Section, take a reference.
So right now we're just focused on this definition, and then I'll explain the larger context for the municipal bylaws. So the problem with this definition is that it's considerably too broad a definition of emergency shelter. So we have another section of Title 24 that, along with schools and churches and hospitals, requires that municipalities provide zoning for emergency shelter. And right now, this is the definition for emergency shelter that guides that zoning. There are very limited number of things that the municipality is allowed to regulate that shelter on. And I would offer an example of the reason why this is problematic, right? We're saying municipalities have to be willing to provide zoning for emergency shelters. We're limiting the number of things that they can regulate these shelters on. And then we're not in the definition providing any standards. So I would provide an example of, somebody filing a permit to turn their garage on their property into an emergency shelter. They're not a regulated entity in any way. They're not a social service provider. But I don't see how the municipality would be able to prevent offering them the permit. So I think that's problematic. So this first instance of amendment here would just redefine emergency shelter as community-based shelter, and then would require that that shelter meets the Department of Children and Families standards for operation for shelters. And this brings this section of statute in line with Human Services statute as well, that has a similar definition for community-based shelters. So it seems beneficial to municipalities to have some standards built in to emergency shelters. So that's the first instance. The second instance I believe is unnecessary based on conversation that I've had with Ellen and planners. But this concern was brought to me by my municipal government. Because this section, the limitations on municipal bylaws, section 4413, along with hospitals, schools, etc., includes emergency shelters as one of the allowable uses by right. And then has this short list of things that we can regulate those entities on. And my municipality was interpreting this to mean that any district where, any zoning district where they made emergency shelters an allowable use, they would have to do so by right. And then they could only regulate shelters on this short list of things, but that would not include something, for example, like saying, oh, well, you can't locate that emergency shelter a block away from that elementary school. So no conditional zoning for emergency shelters. But it sounds to me like that's not how things have been going in practice for municipalities with respect to other things like hospitals, schools, churches. And so I think potentially this second half of the amendment is unnecessary, and that we just need to communicate well with my city to let them know that they can have a little bit more nuanced interpretation of this statute, so that they could have maybe one or two zoning districts where they allow full permitting for community-based shelters, and then in other districts, they could just have more restrictive conditional use permitting for community-based shelters. So that's my explanation of the issue.
Yeah. Ellen, do you want to?
Or Ellen Tchaikovsky, Office of Legislative Counsel. So, yeah, and the language that is under Rep. Logan's name doesn't have the full list. Sorry, so I can talk you through it a little bit more. And maybe one of the issues is consistency of terms. And so generally in zoning, municipalities have the authority to define zoning districts and identify within each district the uses that are permitted as of right and which are conditional uses requiring review and approval. And so that's established in 4414, that's the general zoning statute. And then 4413 has this list of defined uses which the municipality has limited oversight over. And so the following uses can be regulated only with respect to location, size, height, building, bulk, yards, courtyards, setbacks, density of buildings, off-street parking, loading facilities, traffic, noise, lighting, landscaping, and screening. And only to the extent that they don't have the effect of interfering with the intended functional use. And so the municipality does have the authority to regulate these aspects of the project. And so that doesn't mean, I never interpreted that as meaning that the municipality couldn't issue permits on that. And so I did look to see how other municipalities have been doing this. And so the other listed things under 4413 above emergency shelters are, as Rep. Logan were mentioning, state or community owned and operated institutions and facilities, which is a little bit vague, public and private schools and educational institutions, churches and other places of worship, public and private hospitals, solid waste management facilities, hazardous waste management facilities. And then the two that were added more recently were emergency shelters and hotels and motels converted to permanently affordable housing. And so before those last two were added, that list of 6 things has been in statute for quite a while. And I looked at 4 different towns and how they have their zoning set up currently. Montpelier, Brattleboro, Heinsberg, and Manchester. And setting emergency shelters aside, it does look like for the rest of those things on those lists, the municipality has identified in which zoning districts those things are permitted and in which they are conditional use. But the conditional use review for those things on the list are limited to that list of things identified in A. So it's even sort of a modified conditional use. And so I think emergency shelters should follow that same format. It's being added. And so I think perhaps the statute doesn't actually say which form of the permitting towns should use. And so that is a little ambiguous. And again, the 110 towns have zoning, so I haven't reviewed how other zoning towns have done this. And so I think there could be some discrepancies. But the overall intent of the statute generally is that municipalities have limited authority over these types of uses, and they're limited to this list of things.
So, you said those municipalities do offer a conditional use development review process for those uses in those zoning districts, but then they use only this list? Yes. Okay, yeah. So I think this would mean that the second instance of amendment might be necessary for the purposes that Burlington has. And what's that?
Might be necessary?
Might be necessary, because this list does not include some of the issues that my city council brought up when considering how to amend their zoning ordinances to update it for this emergency shelter piece. They want to be able to, for example, do things that would require certain operational standards. Like, for example, for the shelter,
Like what?
like not closing for part of the day.
And so by changing
or-
the definition, we don't address the meaning of definition, standards for operating shelters?
That, I mean, if you read that, you would see that it does not, the standards, the Agency of Human Services standards for emergency shelters do allow shelters to close for part of the day as long as they have permission from the Department of Children and Families. I think that the city council also doesn't think that they can regulate, like, for example, with respect to location, where an emergency shelter is located, in proximity to, say, like an elementary school. And then another thing that they felt like they could,
Can regulate with respect to.
but I think it's the interpretation of location is really unclear. This is one of the things we've been talking about for a few months at this point.
But I think we're hearing that.
So location specifically, I think, is one of the ambiguities in the statute. And so what is meant by the ability of the town to regulate the location? Does that mean within a parcel itself, which is sort of more akin to like a setback or a coverage requirement, which is in line with what else is happening here? Or does it mean proximity to other things or exclusions from certain zones?
What I'm hearing is towns are not, they're not finding they need to allow these in every zone. They have to allow them in a zone in their town. They have to allow them, is the way it's been interpreted.
Yeah, well, what we want to be able to do in Burlington is allow them by right so that you can have an expedited process for emergency shelter project permitting in a couple of zones. And then in all of the other zones, we would like them to be conditional use.
So is this just for
Could-
Burlington?
No,
No, this would be for the whole state.
just using it as an example.
But this problem has come up in a number of Chittenden County municipalities as well as folks have been updating their zoning ordinances. And the way that most municipalities have responded to this is by just picking a tiny little zoning district somewhere in the municipality where they do provide zoning for emergency shelter and then excluding them from other places. What Burlington would like to do is offer them conditional use throughout the entire city, but then by right in just a couple of zones. And we were under the impression that we couldn't do that. Like another thing, for example, that they would want to do is say not grant as conditional use an emergency shelter in a residential neighborhood if it's a low barrier shelter. And this would not allow, like a conditional, this list would not allow them to like even in a conditional use process, development review would not allow them to say like, no, you can't, we're not going to issue you a permit because it's a low barrier shelter.
What is a low barrier shelter?
Low barrier shelter means you have
Take
to
intoxicated
take
people.
anyone. Yeah,
Like,
intoxicated people who use substances. Yeah, people with criminal records, things like that. And they want to be able to say like, they want to have more discretion about where we're putting low barrier shelters within the city. And they feel like they can't do that.
I think they can do that under what we've just heard.
I don't think so, because
There's no distinction made. There's just currently community, it's just emergency shelter under that definition.
right,
And so there isn't any distinction made about if it's low barrier or not.
right, exactly. So they would want to be able to say under other standards that are developed by the municipality for conditional use for community-based shelters, they would want to say like, this area is not an appropriate place to have a low barrier shelter. So that's why the second instance of amendment, if you go into page 2, I had suggested that for community-based shelters under the subsection, so that list that Ellen was talking about, a municipality is required to permit such shelters in at least one district and may use conditional use review for community-based shelters in other districts. But I'm wondering if that.
I mean, I don't know if that covers what you just described.
Yeah, that's, okay,
Okay.
I don't think so either. So, okay,
Right.
I don't want to spend too much group time on it.
yeah,
You can, but I do, if we did change the emergency shelter definition, can we, is it cited, is that a definition in statute from Department of Children and Families? Because how would anyone ever find that definition? That's not very helpful.
so it brings it in line with the definition of shelter that is in H91 that we're in the process
So-
of passing.
Doesn't have a statutory reference yet.
No,
Is that
not
what you're
No.
saying? Okay.
Yeah,
But it will
it's the
have-
Housing Opportunities Program is what it's specifically referring to.
And it doesn't, but it should have anyway, it should have a reference. How do you do that?
Well, so, no. So so unless and until that bill passes and becomes law, it won't have a statutory citation. So I can't really add a cross-reference, but I took the language out of H91 and put it in here.
So this would create the definition in statute that refers to the DCF's standard for operation for shelters.
Can't we pull that in though? Like I'm
Because
like,
that's not in statute.
but if I'm like a lawyer trying, well, then we need to put it in statute. Or like, how would I know what this is? How do I know what a community-based shelter is? Like, where would I go find it?
In the Department of Children and Family Standards for Operation for Shelters.
And then okay. Can you send it to me?
Yeah,
Okay, that would be good.
Yeah.
We need to know what that is.
okay.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, why wouldn't this just be for Burlington? Why would this be a state? There is already a mandate that you have to provide a location for homeless. Right?
For emergency, yeah, that's
For
what
emergency.
we're
So
looking at
that's,
right now.
yeah, so I know in Colchester, with the motel program, we had Because transportation was a big part of it. And so we had motels on a transportation on a bus line. So we had a lot of people at those motels because they could get to work on the bus line. So would this change this for Colchester?
Well, the hotel motel program, those aren't actually emergency shelters. So, yeah. That's a little different. If they were operated as emergency shelters under the DCF standards, then they would be considered an emergency shelter. I guess it depends to how emergency shelters define in your actual ordinances, but like that's another example of a thing that Burlington would want to be able to regulate a shelter on is proximity to public transportation. For example, if it's like just a general adult population of people experiencing homelessness, they would like folks to be able to be within, a quarter mile of public transportation, for example.
Right, but presumably people developing these shelters also want that.
I understand that.
Yeah.
Try telling that to the Burlington City Council. So essentially the effect is that if we don't change statutes so that they can offer community-based shelter as a conditional use in most of the city and be able to make decisions on operational things like the type I've discussed, they'll exclude shelter from zoning throughout the city, except for a couple of locations.
Okay, that's clear, I think. Yeah, and I lost my train of thought, but when we made the change, which was pretty recent, that required towns to provide emergency shelters, the intent of that was that every town had to accommodate an emergency shelter, correct? Or allow it everywhere. I think it was just have one.
Okay.
What's the history of that? Remind us of
Yeah.
that. Because there was a particular
So there were
towns that weren't.
Right. There were particular towns where there had been an effort to try to establish an emergency shelter over the course of years. And the conditional use process had held up permitting for any shelter in the municipality for that entire time. So this was Hartford, St. Johnsbury. Can't remember where the other project was, somewhere in Lamoille County, Morrisville. No, I can't remember. And so we did want to take action to make sure that municipalities just figured it out. Like you have to offer at least one place in your municipality where you will allow an emergency shelter. Burlington was kind of the opposite.
They want to do more.
We already had we already allowed emergency shelter as a conditional use throughout the entire city of Burlington. And so then changing the statute, well, there are two pieces. So changing the statute led city officials to believe that now anywhere we allow emergency shelter as as a use of any kind, then they would not be able to regulate emergency shelter. They wouldn't be able to review those projects in the way that they would like to be able to.
Right. Yeah.
So then they were going to contract the, availability of permits for emergency shelter to a couple of very small regions that both happen to be in my district. And there were plans already underway to open smaller family shelters in various parts of the city, and then that was going to become impossible. And one currently permitted family shelter is in my district, slightly outside of one of the areas that they were gonna allow zoning for emergency shelter by right. And so that family shelter would have become, I guess it would have been grandfathered in, so it would have been able to, anyway, it was creating it's creating a problem for us. So it solved the bigger problem of being able to have emergency shelters more evenly distributed throughout the state, so they're not just concentrated in a few towns. But it created this other problem of like, not, cities like Burlington not knowing how to handle the zoning and not feeling like they have enough flexibility to make sure that.
Okay, I think I understand it better now, and but I do think there's now some time for offline newly, unless members have further questions. Or Ellen has something to add, or Representative Pritchard.
I mean, is this something that the municipality can't correct itself? Does this require us to?
It does. I believe.
Well, it leaves me wondering if the shelter piece really belonged on that list. And because now you're calling it out and having its own separate one, but I think it does. And I think, I'm happy to talk it through with you.
Yeah.
And see.
Yeah, I will say the language as got passed originally was formulated by folks in human services.
Although we rolled it into the housing bill
We did,
and.
but
yeah.
they misunderstood actually
Mhm.
what they were accomplishing.
Mm.
They thought that they were requiring municipalities to offer zoning by right for emergency shelter everywhere.
Everywhere,
Yeah, that's what they thought they were doing.
I remember.
Yeah. And I remember having the conversation to explain to them that that's not exactly what would happen, but it would mean that, St. Johnsbury is going to have to try to figure out where the shelter was going to go in St. Johnsbury. And so that was good enough for them, but then,
That's not enough for towns who want to do more. That's the short story.
correct.
So you can noodle on that. The intention is, I get it now. But do you have further thoughts on this or
Yeah, so, and so this is a flag, actually Rep. Logan, do you still have the statute open? So I made a small error that should be fixed as you continue to consider this, but there's also, between, what would be in the amendment between G and 4 is number 3, which was also part of that housing bill. And so that goes on to say that, for the purposes of this section, regulating daily or seasonal hours of operation for an emergency shelter shall constitute interfering with the intended functional use.
Right.
oh,
Right, so that was another specific thing that was added specifically for emergency shelters, saying that towns could not regulate their daily or seasonal hours. And so,
yeah.
So my suggestion had been that so long as a municipality offer zoning by right for emergency shelter in at least one zone, then otherwise they're exempt from this law. And that would solve both problems, both make sure you have a place where you're gonna have an emergency shelter in your town, and then do whatever else you want. Basically.
Oh, anyway, I think let's go ahead.
Which would be great for Burlington.
Good.
Okay, so I can just say from Colchester's experience, it cost the constituents of Colchester thousands of dollars because of the services that they needed to go there. The fire, rescue, police were called 2 or 3 times a night. In shelters. So is there any way to put into this that it would be mandated that because it was unsafe? Yeah, that's what worried me. Those places were unsafe for people. And
Which places are you talking about?
well, this was the motel.
Yeah, and that's not an
Yeah.
emergency shelter.
Well,
Because it doesn't follow the standards of
what?
services.
Yeah,
At the
An
emergency shelter.
an
See, I would
emergency-
Want services.
well, yeah, but that would qualify as an emergency shelter. Emergency shelters offer services.
24/7.
I can send everyone the regulation, like, I can send everyone the standards from the Department of Children and Families, but like, that's what I mean when I say the hotel motel program is
Yeah.
different
Okay.
than what,
Yeah.
than an emergency
As long as
shelter.
people were safe, I think, you know.
Yeah,
I would
no,
say
it's a very
And
different,
as long as Colchester wasn't paying for it, but as long as the state was funding it.
yeah, so that's one of the reasons for including that reference to the Department of Children and Family Standards of Operation.
Yeah.
Is because there is no entity that is running an emergency shelter that meets those standards of operation that isn't receiving funding either from the state or the federal government. That's just how it is. So I want to exclude this requirement that there be an emergency shelter in a municipality unless it's a regulated, you know,
I just feel like Chittenden County takes the brunt of homeless, taking care of homeless.
and Rutland City.
Yep, and Rutland.
Yeah.
Rutland.
Brattleboro,
Well,
Middlebury,
Well, we can
Berry.
our number.
Springfield.
Okay,
Um,
it's not,
but anyway,
We're not
sorry.
talking about the hotel motel
Yeah.
program right
No,
now.
we're not talking about the hotel motel program.
Okay.
That is not an emergency shelter program,
Okay,
sadly.
thank you for that clarity.
okay, moving on. What I'd like to do is have the conversation about the housing bill and CHIP program and location. And I know, Ellen, you can stick around for the part that's applicable. But do folks have thoughts on, we need to put together a suggestion for the General Housing Committee on this. Welcome your comments. Discussion. Ella.
Let's see, I have so many thoughts and questions about this bill, but focusing on our jurisdiction, I would say that I support looking at this TIF chip program for tier 1A and tier 1B, given that the way those were designed in our last biennium's work, and that they do apply to across the state. Tier 2 edition would literally feel like it includes everywhere, and I'm very concerned that this is a very broad program and seems applicable to the planning goals of tier 1A and 1B as towns figure that out, and that there's exemptions and that it's broader. While, sorry, I don't have the right language, but until tier 1A and tier 1B, it follows where we're also intending to put housing before those get finalized. I have a lot of other concerns about the breadth of the TIF financing piece that I will take up with other committees.
Representative Taglia.
I'm curious what you mean by everywhere. What towns don't deserve a shot at this?
All towns have a shot at tier 1A and tier 1B. So
Can you walk through that process for those of us that maybe don't be super familiar with
maybe Ellen,
I did, remember?
Ellen did walk
Yeah.
us through it.
Yes.
that whole detailed list of what everything has to be in place to be able to, so
So the tier.
any town can apply, if they say, I got a parcel over here, I want to apply for that to be tier 1.
For tier 1A, yeah, and then the tier 1Bs will happen as part of are happening as part of the regional plan approval process.
And they're also, in the interim, focused around village centers, right?
Yeah.
So there's how many hundred, over 100
There's 200.
village centers, so there's gotta be one near you.
So the application process for the tier 1A and or tier 1B, that's already in place. We don't have to wait for that, right?
There are the interim exemptions that are in those general areas. So while we're getting those in place, there's already the exemptions, which if we looked at the amendment John Gray brought us, includes that CHIP program would be eligible in the interim zoning. And then once the final tier 1A and Bs are established, it would go right through.
Can't say that I followed that. So there.
So as it came over from the Senate, how it's worded is that, until the tiers are adopted, the, CHIP program is eligible in the, interim exemptions, which are all of the designated areas have options for the, interim exemptions, plus, things that fall into the definition of existing settlement. And so, even if they haven't been designated as a designated area, they can fulfill their location requirement for being a designated or an existing settlement.
But that's not what we're contemplating. So
No, but that's, but okay, so specific, you're limiting it in a different way.
the John Gray amendment. Settlements would not be part of it. It would be
Okay,
tier 1A, 1B, and the exempt areas.
What is it called? Interim housing?
Yeah.
Exemptions, is that
Yeah.
what it's called?
Home Act.
That includes all kinds of villages. That's much broader than designated downtowns.
Yes.
oh, yes, it's any of the designated areas, that have permanent zoning. And subdivision bylaws. Yeah, so the downtowns, new town centers, village centers, as long as they have zoning. And then as well as the growth centers and neighborhood development areas. There's also the interim exemption for, and it's a quarter mile around a village center as well.
It's in-
Oh, is it half?
Or in the exempt areas.
And then it's also the designated census block that has the 50,000 or more along a transit route, which is that portion of Chittenden County as well. So the designated areas plus that Chittenden County region.
A lot of words, but it doesn't mean anything to me unless I can know, it doesn't apply to his town.
We have,
Show me in his town where it was.
Let's use the town of Washington, right on 110. Couldn't
So-
ask for a better example.
before we do this, we have maps. And I guess but we also are time limited. So we did go through all this. You have testimony from ACCD, was why we were building the knowledge base at the beginning of the session so we could understand where we landed with Act 181. So there's a lot of testimony on our webpage that relates to this. And I mean, go ahead, but we're not going to have the specifics about the town of Washington at our fingertips.
How does he get the specifics to the town?
He could talk to his regional planning commission or the town of Washington.
So what needs to be in place in a town to be able to apply for CHIPS grant?
Well, we're having that conversation right now.
I mean, do you have to have zoning, planning?
So
Do you have to have a
In order to
town
be-
plan?
so they're trying to link it to land use, which is why we're having this conversation. And so we're saying this is our area of jurisdiction is location. And so we're talking about where we are going to recommend that it apply. And right now, talking about whether it should be limited to 1A and 1B, which is part of the Act 181 that we passed last session. It is underway currently in a large process being undertaken by the Land Use Review Board.
So when can we start using? It's underway.
The maps will be done, I think they said by like 2026. They're all working hard. Representative Austin brought hers in. She went last night. I could get a report back on that. But in the intervening time, there are the interim exemptions where this program would also be eligible to apply.
I hear those words, I just don't know where that is.
Okay, we'll get, yeah.
I just sent a map. ACCD has an interim Act 250 exemptions map online that
Great.
they
Thank
have a
you.
little exemption. So they have a little disclaimer that it's, read their disclaimer if you want. But anyway, there is a map and I just I'll send it to the whole committee. Sorry, I just sent it to folks. You're asking.
Which is it? Did you send it to all of us or? did
No,
you-
I'm sending it to everybody right now.
Representative Logan.
Yeah, I mean, so it sounds to me like folks have concerns because there isn't widespread knowledge of the tier 1A and tier 1B, like what that means. We took an enormous amount of testimony on that last session. We also heard from a number of developers who work in tier 2 areas. So areas that won't be exempt from Act 250, tier 1 that won't be tier 1A or tier 1B. I mean, I do think that once you see the maps that will be done as the result of the town and regional planning processes that already are happening, and use the characteristics of the towns that are already existing, that are ready for development. I think what we heard from developers is that the Act 250 permitting process is really valuable to the developer themselves, because there's no local capacity to support the developer in moving a project along, and Act 250 fills that hole in the region without that capacity at the municipal government level. And then for this, so that I think is one of the reasons why I'm not a fan of having a TIF project in a tier 2 area, because we're talking about places where there isn't the capacity to support development in the first place. And then you're adding the onerous responsibility of managing a TIF project on top of that. Tier 1A and tier 1B areas are ready-made for that kind of project, but there just might not be the financial capacity to develop places that could be housing, if there was just a little bit of investment. And I think we all have areas like that where we live in the more densely populated parts of our districts. There are just vacant pieces of property all over the place that I know could be redeveloped, but it would require public investment. And this is a really reasonable way to provide public investment. So I don't support a project-based TIF in tier 2, but absolutely in 1A and 1B. These are areas that would not have been developed. I do wish there was a little bit more of a guardrail there. This is like outside of our committee. I wish there was a little bit more of a guardrail there in terms of, but if for, is that the terminology that John used? But if for, what?
But for,
But for a but for standard. But these, in general, these TIF projects should be projects that, but for the TIF project financing, would not have taken place. We know that there are a lot of projects that will go forward if we put this in place, that the value of that land in terms of its property tax valuation and its that contribution to the ed fund that folks are concerned about, that land laying there stagnant for years and years would not have added to that fund. So allowing TIF financing to add value to that area makes a lot of sense to me. But yeah, limiting it to tier 1A and 1B makes the most sense. I need a really strong argument to the contrary, because I don't know, unless the TIF could be used to build out the infrastructure that would essentially make that area tier 1B. That seems like almost what would happen, actually.
Which could happen in a village, I suppose. I don't know.
Yeah. But anyway,
That was all.
yeah.
Representative Morris.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm trying to understand all of this, and to the point of the concerns for towns outside of 1A, 1B. And I realize they still have the option to go through Act 250. The criteria is there. there's no prevention from building. Other than the fact that they have to go through the Act 250 and meet the criteria. When we're talking about the CHIP program, there are specific requirements to make a piece of property eligible. I'm just going down through those here. Gee, so what's that? 7 of them. It also, when you get to the infrastructure portion of that, there's an infrastructure requirement. There's an agreement between the developer and a municipality, and there has to be infrastructure. That's the way I'm reading it. That would be the agreement between the town and the developer. And I believe TIP projects, help me out with this one, those have to be voted on because you're taking out a bond for the development. So that has to be voted on by the citizens of that community. So I think, I'm trying to understand this, that there are guardrails for this program, for the type of project and the agreement and the infrastructure that would enable tier 2 development. I've talked with contractors in my community to try to take advantages of other state programs, BHIP and so on, to try to develop housing. And it's got that income sensitivity component that prevents them from wanting to make that agreement. So we're not getting development. We need development, we need housing. And I think this is a program that could work and that might entice, and if we entice developers to build, if we put too many guardrails on it, we're going to be in the same, my opinion, the same predicament we were with those other programs. The developers aren't going to take advantage of it. And I think there are some guardrails. I don't think it's going to enable the development on a mountaintop or 2,500 feet off a roadway. There's specific infrastructure requirements, and there's an agreement between the town and the developer. So somebody's got to convince me that it wouldn't work for tier 2. I'm trying to be sensitive to that. I understand the 1A, 1B. That goes without saying. I think that's automatic.
Representative Logan.
Representative Morris, I think the area that you're talking about not being developed currently in Springfield would end up being tier 1A and or 1B once we go through the land use mapping process. I have a hard
Perhaps I
time.
didn't make myself clear. The developers in 1A, 1B, and 1A, because we could be a 1A community, didn't take advantage of those other programs. And I'm just suspicious that if we put additional guardrails onto the CHIP program, potentially we could end up in the same predicament where developers aren't going to take advantage of it.
Particularly the income sensitivity piece.
But that was with the other program. This one doesn't have.
Yeah, so
necessarily.
what guardrails are you concerned about that we're trying to put on the program? We're just trying to, because what you're talking about in your community are,
Turning it to 1A, 1B.
why?
That's a guardrail.
But you're referencing your own community and the barriers
I
to
referenced my
development there.
community for projects that 2 developers opted out of from developing. I am concerned about the CHIP program replicating a lack of desire from developers from building. And we have requirements for this, and we have a cooperative agreement that has to be approved by the voters for the bonding.
What section are you referring to again?
Well, that's the other thing. We get 2 drafts up here.
Our draft is not significantly different than the Commerce one, except for
Let's say house environment CHIP. JLG, the date's 4:30, the time it's 8:49 AM.
which section are you in?
Page 4, 1908, creation of a housing infrastructure project and housing development site. And then the infrastructure agreement is on page 5, line 16 under 1909. I'm just trying to understand concerns of other members about developing everywhere, and we keep saying, well, you can. Check the maps of your community and they're 1A, 1B, or
You can go through the Act 250 process.
the Act 250, you still can right now.
One of the reasons we made the changes, or supposedly the legislature made the changes, was because of Act 250 is too oppressive. We just before lunch, not me, other members here said financial issues were the issues that caused the lack of housing, which is BS. It's only one of them. But Act 250 is the problem. It's not the solution. Number one. Number two, every time rural Vermont they get this little carrot waved in front of them, and then stuff like this happens, and option tier 2 gets waved through, gets dipped in the soup, and then gets taken out. Tier 2 is in there, leave it in there. Otherwise, just for the record, I'm a hard no.
Okay, good to know. Representative Logan?
I'm struggling to imagine a project that anyone could propose in a tier 2 area that would be viable. I think all the areas that people are referring to in their communities or within their districts where they could imagine projects happening using this TIF, project-based TIF, are going to be in tier 1B at the very least, if not tier 1A areas. Unless you're talking about building out in the middle of a farm field, I don't really understand what, like if it's well-traveled, if there's, if you're in an area that has some municipal government and there's some infrastructure to support.
Another way of looking at this is that previous TIF programs have been incredibly limited to maybe 12 communities because they're expensive in one way of looking at it. They have their costs to the ed fund. So we've been very cautious in how we've utilized that tool. This is a different way of using the same concept. It's going to be bounded. It's going to be limited. We can't say, yippee, let's go. I don't think responsibly. The way we pay for education in the state doesn't make sense to open it up to everywhere. And I guess to me, the logical place is to say where communities invested in wanting development, they've made a plan and they want walkable communities. They want the things that we've committed to. So this is, other committees are going to put a boundary on this.
Because of the monetary limitations.
Yes.
Could we address some of the monetary limitations by making it rather than 100% of the funding going, the increment fund tax going to pay off the bond, like a 50-50 share or something? So some of it still goes toward education.
I guess I would say I don't know enough about that world to be that person. I'm not on the Ways and Means Committee. I trust that they will look at that.
But the ideas like that are being floated, I assume.
Mhm.
They are.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think John said this morning that's in their draft.
Yeah, it's in the
50-50
draft.
share.
It's not 50, it's 70-30, I think.
Yeah. Then it goes like, yeah.
It's on some,
Yeah.
some declination over time.
Mhm.
All right. Not seeing further comments on this, so we will adjourn for the afternoon. Thanks, Ellen.